In the spring of 1901, a New Zealand-born geologist named George Bernard Reynolds stepped off a ship in Persia, carrying surveying equipment and an obsessive dream. He was 42 years old, had worked in the Sumatran oil fields, and had just been hired by a British millionaire named William Knox Darcy, who had never set foot in Persia and never would. Darcy had made his fortune in Australian gold mines. Now, sitting in his London mansion, he'd become convinced that Persia held oil, vast quantities of it. The evidence was circumstantial, but tantalizing. Ancient fire temples where natural gas had burned for centuries, bitumen seeps that locals had used for millennia, and geological surveys suggesting promising structures beneath the desert. Darcy had negotiated a concession from Muzaffar al-Din Shah, the Qajar ruler of Persia, giving him exclusive rights to explore for oil across 480,000 square miles, roughly three-quarters of the entire country. The cost? £20,000 in cash, £20,000 in shares, and 16% of future profits. It was one of the most lopsided deals in history, negotiated by a former British diplomat who understood the Shah's desperate need for money far better than the Shah understood the potential value of what lay beneath his kingdom. Reynolds began in the mountains of western Persia, near the Iraqi border, where oil seeps darkened the rocks. He hired local workers, ordered drilling equipment shipped from Europe via the Persian Gulf, and began the grinding work of exploration in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. The summers reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The winters brought snow and freezing winds. Bandits roamed the mountains. Local tribes demanded payments for drilling on their land. Equipment broke constantly. Wells that showed promise turned dry. Reynolds sent telegraph after telegraph to London, requesting more money, more equipment, more time. Darcy, watching his fortune drain away, began to panic. By 1905, he'd spent over £200,000, millions in today's money, with nothing to show for it but dry holes and mounting debts. He was on the verge of bankruptcy. Enter the British Admiralty. Admiral John Jackie Fisher, First Sea Lord of the British Royal Navy, was obsessed with a problem that seemed purely technical, but would reshape global geopolitics. Coal versus oil. British warships ran on Welsh coal, as they had for a century. But Fisher, a visionary who understood that the next war would be won by speed and efficiency, knew that oil-fired ships could travel faster, refuel quicker, and required smaller crews. He'd seen demonstrations, he'd studied the numbers. Oil was superior in every way. Except Britain had no oil. The United States was producing it. Russia had it at Baku. The Dutch East Indies showed promise. But Britain, the world's dominant naval power, was entirely dependent on foreign supplies for the fuel that would power its future fleet. Fisher convinced the government to back a syndicate called Burma Oil Company to take over Darcy's Persian concession. The company sent a Scottish technician named George Reynolds, no relation to GB, to assess the operation. What he found was chaos. Broken equipment, demoralized workers, and G.B. Reynolds himself, gaunt and exhausted, still drilling in the face of repeated failures. But G.B. Reynolds believed. The geology was right. The signs were there. He just needed to drill deeper, in the right place. In 1907, drilling began at a new site called Masjid-e-Suleiman, the Mosque of Solomon, a desolate spot where natural gas had burned for centuries and ancient fire worshippers had built temples. Reynolds positioned his rig carefully, studying the rock formations, the seeps, the angles of the strata. They drilled through the summer heat, through autumn, into winter. The bit chewed through limestone, sandstone, layers of rock that revealed the ancient history of the earth, but no oil. By early 1908, Burma Oil was losing patience. They sent a telegram to Reynolds. Abandon the operation. Pack up. Come home. The money was gone. The telegram arrived at the base camp in early May. Reynolds decided to interpret it creatively. He would drill just a bit longer to reach a depth that would allow him to cement the well properly before abandoning it. Just a few more days. At 4 a.m. on May 26, 1908, A British driller named E.T.L. Wilson was on night watch at Masjid-e-Suleiman when the drill bit, at a depth of 1,180 feet, punched through into a cavity. The rig began to shake. A rumble rose from deep in the earth. Then, with a roar that woke the entire camp, a column of oil shot into the air, drenching the derrick, the equipment, the workers who came running from their tents. Reynolds, pulled from sleep, stood in his nightclothes, watching black gold fountain into the Persian dawn. 7 years, hundreds of thousands of pounds, countless wells that had yielded nothing, and now this, oil gushing at such pressure that it took days to cap the well. He sent a telegram to London. See Psalm 104, verse 15, third sentence. The verse reads, "That he may bring out of the earth oil to make him a cheerful countenance." News of the discovery electrified London. In April 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was founded, the company that would eventually become BP. The British government bought a controlling stake in 1914, securing oil supplies just as World War I began. But the story of Middle Eastern oil had only just begun. While the British were drilling in Persia, the Arabian Peninsula remained almost entirely unexplored. The Ottoman Empire nominally controlled much of it, but in reality, vast stretches were ruled by Bedouin tribes and regional powers. The interior was so forbidding that even the Ottomans didn't bother trying to govern it. In 1932, a Bedouin warrior named Abdul Aziz ibn Saud completed his conquest of the peninsula, uniting it as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He'd fought for 30 years, building alliances, winning battles, subduing rivals. Now he ruled a kingdom roughly the size of Western Europe. He was also nearly bankrupt. Saudi Arabia's economy depended on pilgrims visiting Mecca. The Great Depression had devastated that income. Ibn Saud needed money desperately for his government, his army, his enormous extended family, and the tribal leaders whose loyalty he'd bought with gold. The British had the Persian oil fields. Surely, Ibn Saud reasoned, similar riches might lie beneath his own desert kingdom. He granted exploration rights to a British trader, but the British showed little interest. Iraq had oil, Persia had oil. The British didn't need more desert concessions. The Americans, however, were interested. Standard Oil of California, SoCal, later Chevron, had been shut out of Iraq by British and French oil companies who'd carved up Mesopotamia after World War I. They were hungry for new reserves and willing to gamble on Arabia. In May 1933, after months of negotiations, Ibn Saud's finance minister, Abdullah Sulaiman, signed a concession agreement with SoCal. The terms gave SoCal exclusive rights to explore for oil in eastern Saudi Arabia, an area of about 360,000 square miles, in exchange for an immediate loan of £30,000 in gold, annual rental payments, and royalties if oil was discovered. SoCal created a subsidiary called the California Arabian Standard Oil Company, CASOC, and sent their best geologist, a quiet, methodical Montanan named Max Steinecke, to find out if Saudi Arabia had any oil at all. Max Steinecke arrived in Saudi Arabia in 1934 with a small team of American geologists and a fleet of local guides. What they faced was geological detective work on an almost impossible scale. There were no roads, no maps worth the name, no infrastructure. Summer temperatures exceeded 120 degrees. Sandstorms could last for days. Water was scarce. The few Bedouin they encountered were sometimes hospitable, sometimes hostile, always wary of these strange foreigners with their instruments and incomprehensible mission. Steinecke began by studying surface geology, the exposed rock formations that might hint at what lay below. He found a promising structure called Dammam Dome, a subtle rise in the landscape near the Persian Gulf coast where limestone formations suggested the possibility of oil-bearing strata beneath. In 1935, drilling began at Dammam Well Number 1. It was dry. Well Number 2, dry. Well Number 3, traces of oil, but not enough to be commercial. Well number 4, dry. Well number 5, dry. Well number 6, a small amount of oil, but the well quickly died. Back in California, SoCal executives were getting nervous. They'd spent millions and found almost nothing. Some argued for abandoning the concession entirely. But Steinecke studied his rock samples, his surveys, his geological maps. He was convinced that oil was there, they just hadn't drilled deep enough. The promising formations were deeper in Arabia than they were in Persia or Iraq. He persuaded the company to drill deeper at Dammam Well number 7. Through 1937 and into 1938, the drill bit chewed through layer after layer of limestone and dolomite. At 3,000 feet, they found traces of oil. Encouraging, but not a strike. Steinecke ordered them to keep drilling. At 4,000 feet, still just traces. At 4,500 feet, more traces, but not enough. Steinecke pored over his samples. The geology suggested they were close, tantalizingly close. He ordered the crew to continue. On March 4, 1938, at a depth of 4,727 feet, Dammam Well number 7 struck oil. Not a trickle, not traces. A commercial flow of 1,585 barrels per day. The drillers tested the well, cleaned it, tested it again. The flow increased. By mid-March, it was producing over 3,000 barrels per day from a geological formation that Steinecke named the Arab Zone, a layer of porous limestone that would become the most prolific oil-producing formation in human history. On May 1, 1939, Ibn Saud sailed on an American tanker to the Ras Tanura terminal, where Dammam Well number 7 was flowing into storage tanks. In a formal ceremony, he turned a valve, and Saudi Arabian oil flowed into the tanker's hold for its first export shipment. Neither Ibn Saud nor the Americans fully grasped what they had found. They knew it was significant, perhaps very significant, but the true scale of Saudi Arabia's oil wealth would only become clear as more wells were drilled and more fields discovered. The Arab Zone extended across thousands of square miles. Beneath it lay other formations, the Ain Dar, the Shedgum, and eventually the monstrous Ghawar field, discovered in 1948, which remains the largest conventional oil field ever found, containing an estimated 70 to 80 billion barrels of recoverable oil. The Americans who came to develop Saudi Arabia's oil fields were a particular breed. Roughnecks, drillers, engineers, and geologists, mostly from Texas, Oklahoma, and California. They built a company town called Dhahran in the empty desert, with air-conditioned houses, a swimming pool, a movie theater, and baseball diamonds. The contrast with traditional Saudi society couldn't have been starker. American families ate bacon at breakfast. Women wore shorts and bathing suits. Workers drank bootleg alcohol distilled in secret stills. On Friday, the Muslim holy day, Americans played baseball while Saudis prayed. This created constant tension. Saudi religious authorities were scandalized. But Ibn Saud, pragmatic and desperate for oil revenue, protected the Americans and their strange ways. He needed them. His kingdom's survival depended on their expertise and their drilling rigs. The Americans, for their part, trained thousands of Saudis in technical skills. Young Saudi men learned to operate drilling rigs, maintain pumps, read geological surveys, and manage industrial operations. This created the first generation of technically educated Saudis, a transformation that would reshape the kingdom more profoundly than anyone anticipated. During World War II, oil production slowed as tankers were diverted to the war effort. But after 1945, production exploded. More fields were discovered. Abqaiq in 1940, Qatif in 1945, Ghawar in 1948. By 1950, Saudi Arabia was producing 500,000 barrels per day. By 1960, over 1 million. By 1970, over 3 million. The money was staggering. Saudi Arabia went from near bankruptcy to unimaginable wealth in a single generation.